My name's Simon Cook, and I've been playing gamelan for a number of years. I first heard a gamelan in 1979 at Durham University. They had something called the Durham Oriental Music Festival, which happened every 3 years. I think they had three altogether, 1976, 1979 and 1982. And when I went there in 1979, I met Alec Roth, who was a graduate student there at the time, I think, or maybe he just finished his music degree. And the person who was instrumental in putting this festival together was the professor of music there called Eric Taylor. In 1979, the group that was performing in Durham was from what was then still called ASCII Solo, which now, of course, is STSE, I think. The Sekolah Kerawitan Indonesia, Akademi Seni Kerawitan Indonesia, with Pak Humardani, Pak Kendong, who was the very idiosyncratic director of that institution, brought his group of dancers and musicians over. And that was an important moment for Alec as well, I think, because that was when he knew that the next thing he wanted to do was to go off and study at ASCII. And they performed Javanese music, quite a modern take on Javanese art, with novelties like the wayang padat, which was a shortened wayang, and I think that their dance moves were also quite well regarded in some circles as quite exaggerated and so on, with very bold gestures and so on from the dancers. And that coincided with my completing my studies in music in this country, and I went to live in the Netherlands after that, because at that time there weren't any groups active in the UK playing gamelan music. However, in the Netherlands there were several groups, first of all at the embassy in The Hague, and then at the Tropenmuseum in Amsterdam, which were active. And there I played, I briefly played some Balinese gamelan in the Tropical Institute, the Tropenmuseum. But unfortunately the teacher who was there at the time left. I'm afraid I can't remember his name, old chap. And so that group kind of ground to a halt. But I got involved with a group, because I was studying at the University of Amsterdam. There was a group directed by Ernst Heijns and his then wife in the Tropenmuseum, and they got music students to go and learn to play simple Javanese pieces. So I did that. And at the same time I got involved with another group which was part of an organisation called CREA, which was linked to the university, but in an extracurricular way. And there I joined a group directed by a woman called Elsje Plantema, playing Central Javanese music. And she was an ex-student of Ernst Heijns. And I arrived at just the right moment, because she was putting a group together which was going to perform in the Holland Festival. They were going to perform wayang kulit, but with a Javanese dalang, with a Dutch dalang called Rien Baartmans, who was a professional puppeteer, who had a very successful television puppetry program called Ricky and Slingertje, but was also a fanatical gamelan player and wayang, student of wayang, and a student of Pak Rono Soripto from the Mangkunagaran, who was also Ernst Heinz's mentor. So I got involved in that group, and for about 5 years I played with that group, which came to be called Raras Budoyo in The Hague, in Amsterdam. And I played a few times as a guest. I went along to rehearsals of the group, which met at the embassy in The Hague. But I never became a member of that group because I was living in Amsterdam. And there were various smaller groups, little offshoots, playing what's it called, Gadon, which is just a small chamber group with just 4 or 5 players at that time. And it was while I was living in Amsterdam that I first heard about the group which Alec Roth and Neil Sorrell and a few others like Jan Steele and Mark, what's his name? Mark, I've forgotten his last name, tall chap from Birmingham, and all those people set up in England, called appropriately enough EGO, which stands for the English Gamelan Orchestra. And I don't quite know what was going through their heads when they formed a group with that acronym, because of course EGO is not what you want when you're playing gamelan music, because I feel that gamelan music is a music where the individual is subsumed in the whole rather than... Anyway, I was visiting England in the early 80s, and I got in touch with Neil Sorrell at York University, and told him about what I'd been doing in the Netherlands, and he invited me along to a rehearsal at KBRI down in the basement. Seems for some reason that gamelan always ends up in the basement of buildings, like at the South Bank and at KBRI and here at City University. It seems to be music for troglodytes in the UK. And there we rehearsed. Adrian Lee was part of that group. And we rehearsed a program which was a mixed program of Central Javanese music and original compositions. So Mark Lockett was his name. Remember, we played a piece of his called The Olive Tree, and then Jan got up and blew his saxophone, and we did a very silly piece with saxophone and gamelan. And we performed at just around the corner at Sadler's Wells, which was this was before it was refurbished, so it was pretty run down at that time. And I remember we shared the bill with a group from the Philippines who marched around waving flags and things on stage. So that was my first encounter with gamelan in the UK. I also went to visit Alec in Durham, because by that time he was doing his PhD researching new music from ASCII composers, and Pat Srihastanto was also a fellow student of his, who later became director of ASCII, or STC by that time, and they were both in Durham, and I went and visited them once when I was living in the Netherlands. And by the time I moved back to England, which was in 1984, there was a gamelan at York where Neil Sorrell had got a nice Central Javanese gamelan, and Prof Professor Taylor had just scraped together some funds to get some instruments at Durham University. So they started off with a very small Salendro set, again, Central Javanese. Everything was Central Javanese in those days.